Hello everyone. Today, I want to talk about something that exists in every classroom, every school, and every interaction between educators and students. Our beliefs. More specifically, how our beliefs shapes the way we interpret the students, respond to them, and ultimately influence their educational experiences. This presentation explores an important problem in education: the gap between teacher intention and student impact. As educators, we often intend to help students. However, research suggests that our assumptions, expectations, and personal belief may unintentionally affect students emotionally, socially, and academically. Throughout this presentation, I will connect personal experiences, classroom examples, and current educational research to explain why reflective and inquiry-based teaching practices are essential for creating emotional responsive classrooms. When my mother was 7 years old, she discovered that her father had another family. Her parents had divorced years earlier, and my grandmother moved to Spain with her 6 children. Years later, my grandfather traveled from Venezuela to Spain for my aunt's wedding. During that visit, he showed my mother a photograph of his new family, including 4 children she did not know existed. That was the moment my mother discovered she had 4 other siblings. Someone observing the situation tried to comfort her. Her brother-in-law, who was studying psychiatry at the time, approached my mother and told her, "But you are much prettier." He believed he was helping. He believed he understood what the child needed emotionally in that time. And honestly, many adults probably will have interpreted the situation similarly. This is important because educators constantly interpret situations and respond based on what they believe students are feeling or needing. However, one of the biggest problems in education is that intention does not always match impact. So let me ask you something. What do you think a 7-year-old child would feel after hearing that? Many adults might assume comfort, reassurance, validation, and that is exactly what the adult assumed she needed. But years later, my mother explained that what she actually felt was completely different. And I will return to that later, because this moment reveals something very important about education. Adults often respond to children based on interpretation rather than understanding. This is not an isolated situation. Recently, I read a story about a teacher who saw a 5-year-old child's drawing and immediately became concerned. The teacher interpreted the drawing through her own beliefs and experiences, leading to a serious reaction. Later, the child's father laughed about the situation and shared it online. What fascinated me most was not determining who was right or wrong. It was observing how every person interpreted the exact same situation differently. The teacher interpreted the drawing through concern, the father through humor. People online interpreted it through their own beliefs, fears, experiences, and value as well. This is exactly what happens in classrooms every day. We do not enter classrooms as neutral observers. We interpret a student through our own experiences, expectations, and beliefs. The problem I want to address today is the gap between teacher intention and student impact. In education, teachers often respond to students based on assumptions rather than understanding a students' actual thoughts, emotions, and perspective. Research by One, which examined teacher belief systems and instructional practices, found that teacher beliefs strongly influence classrooms' interpretation, instructional decisions, and interactions with the students. Similarly, Thunder et al., in a systematic review of teacher beliefs and classroom practices, found that teachers' personal beliefs consistently shape how educators respond to students and make instructional decisions even when they are not consciously aware of those beliefs. This means that when teachers interpret behavior, participation, or emotional responses Those interpretations are influenced not only by the student's action, but also by the teacher's own experiences and perspective. Sometimes educators assume why a child is crying, why a student is angry, why a child refuses to participate, or why a student behaves in a certain way. However, Lee, in research about teacher beliefs and classroom instructions, explains that educators' beliefs directly affect emotional responses and communications with the students. When teachers respond based on assumptions instead of understanding, they may unintentionally affect students emotionally and academically. This problem matters because teacher responses shape students' experiences. Kentrup et al., in research about teacher expectations and self-fulfilling prophecies, explain that teacher expectations can influence students' confidence, motivation, and academic outcomes over time. In other words, the way teachers interpret and respond to students can shape how students begin to see themselves. Haiti, in his synthesis of over 2,100 meta-analyses related to achievement, emphasizes that teacher influence and classroom relationships significantly impact students' learning and emotional development. This means that even small interactions between teacher and students matter deeply. Teachers' beliefs are not neutral. They shape how educators interpret behavior, emotion, participation, and even students' potential. What are beliefs? Beliefs are shaped by experiences, culture, personal history, values, and previous interactions with the students. Research by May et al., which explored teachers' belief about learning principles, suggests that teachers' belief influence how educators interpret learning, communication, and student behavior in the classroom. Similarly, Lee found that teacher beliefs affect classroom interactions and emotional responses to students. This means that before teachers act, teachers believe, and those beliefs influence interpretation before interaction even begins. Research strongly supports the connection between teacher beliefs and classroom practices. Tondor et al., in their systematic review of the teacher belief practice gap, found that teachers' beliefs strongly influence classroom decisions and teaching practices, even when educators believe they are being objective. Haiti also explains that teacher expectations, classroom relationships, and instructional interactions significantly affect learning outcomes. Additionally, Butts and Dewick, in research about the development of growth and fixed mindsets in children, explain that the messages children receive from adults influence how students view themselves, learning, mistakes, and intelligence. In other words, what teachers believe affects how students experience school. The problem is not only what teachers do. The problem is what teachers believe before they act. Research consistently demonstrates that belief influences educational practices, expectations, and communication with the students. Because belief shapes interpretation, and interpretation shapes response. So, how do we reduce this problem in education? Research suggests that one of the most important shifts educators can make is moving from assumptions to inquire. Tunder et al. Explained that because beliefs strongly influence classroom practice, reflective and inquiry-based approaches are essential for improving teacher-student interactions. Ryan and Ryan, in research about reflective professional learning, found that reflective teaching practices help educators recognize how assumptions influence classroom interaction and decision-making. This means teachers should slow down interpretation and instead gather context before responding. Instead of assuming students' emotions, educators should create opportunities for students to explain their own experiences. This approach helps teachers understand students more accurately instead of projecting adult interpretations onto children. I experienced this in my own classroom. One day, a 4-year-old child looked at me and my co-teacher and asked, "How do you make a baby?" Immediately, we both looked at each other in panic. We instantly interpreted the question through an adult's lens. I was already preparing an answer in my head. But before I could respond, my co-teacher stopped me and asked the child, "Why are you asking?" And the child replied, "We are building a house with Legos and we want to make a baby." And suddenly, everything changed. The child was not asking what we assumed he was asking. The moment reminded me how quickly adults create meaning based on their own beliefs and experiences. Ryan and Ryan explained that reflective questioning and active listening help educators avoid immediate assumptions and improve understanding in classroom interactions. One simple question completely changed our interpretation. Research strongly supports inquiry-based and student-centered communication. Ryan and Ryan explain that reflective teaching practices help educators become more aware of how assumptions influence classroom interactions and decision-making. Khalif and Biscrow, in research about culturally responsive school leadership, emphasize that educators must understand students' perspectives and experiences before reacting to behaviors or situations. Research also shows that teacher beliefs affect emotional responses, classroom interactions, and instructional practices. Effective teaching requires curiosity before conclusion. Ask, don't assume. Questions matter because they give students a voice, reduce misinterpretation, build emotional safety, strengthen their relationships, and support social emotional development. Brown, in research about formative feedback and teachers' belief, found that reflective and responsive communication practices improve classroom trust and student engagement. Similarly, Silva Didier, in research about teachers' belief and student feedback, explains that educators' belief influence how teachers interpret and respond to student communication. When students feel heard and understood, classrooms become more intentionally safer spaces for learning. Questions create connections. Assumptions can create distance. To address this problem, research recommends that schools support educators through professional development, reflective teaching practices, social emotional learning strategies, active listening, and cultural responsive communication. Han, in research about inclusive educational practices and universal design for learning, explains that inclusive classrooms require educators to intentionally create environments where students feel understood and supported. In research about teachers' efficacy and professional growth, Edwards highlights the importance of collaborative reflection and professional learning in improving educational experiences for students. This means schools should not only focus on instructional strategies, but also helping educators reflect on how belief influences interactions with the students. Small changes in communication can create meaningful changes in students' experiences. How often do we respond based on what we think students feel, instead of what they actually feel? I want to return to the beginning now, to the 7-year-old girl. Years later, my mother explained what she actually thought in that moment when the adult told her, "But you are much prettier." She said, "I thought I must be very ugly if he's telling me that." The adult's intention was comfort, but the child experienced shame. Same words, different impact. Research by Gentrup et al. Demonstrates that adult expectations and interpretation can significantly influence children's self-perception and emotional experiences over time. The story reminds us that children do not always interpret situations the way adults expect them to. The intention was to help, but the impact was harm. The difference was a belief. The adult believed he understood the child's experience, but he never asked. And that is the gap this presentation has focused on, the gap between teacher intention and student impact. As educators, our responsibility is not to assume what students feel, think, or need. Our responsibility is to understand, to listen, to ask questions, to create spaces where students feel safe expressing their own perspective and experiences. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a teacher can say is not a statement, it is a question. As educators, our role is not to assume, but to understand. Thank you.